Hey, welcome back to Gold Scratch. So whether you drive a Mopar, a Ford, or GM, if you work with Gen 1 engines, V8 engines, or hot rod engines, and many other makes as well, we have all got something in common. They all are prone to leak, and we hate leaks. So today I'm going to talk about leaks, how to detect them, how to prevent them, how to fix them, and once again, how to find them, which is part of the biggest problem, is finding where the leak came from. I'm going to get to that. So I mentioned Ford and Mopar and Chevrolet. So some of my viewers have been giving me the gears because I drive a Ford truck. For what it's worth, I've had lots of Ford trucks and lots of GM trucks, Chevrolet trucks, both over the years. And right now I happen to have a Ford one. And if that offends you, sorry. It's not religion, guys. Just don't take it too serious. Anyway, let's get on with that. So speaking of Fords, if you look at this picture, Mike's going to put a snapshot. This is a 55 Ford two-door V8 car. And this is a picture of my very first car. It actually isn't the car, but it's identical to my very first car. My buddy, Roger, was on trip on Route 66 going to Arizona, and somewhere along Route 66 he saw this car, so he took a picture of it for me. It's exactly like mine. Mine was this looks like a little more green blue, but you know what, it could be the exact same color. It was a light blue. Anyway, so that's the only Ford car I ever owned. I owned lots of Ford trucks, but criteria, I bought that car in 1964. I was 15 years old. Wasn't old enough to get a license. I did drive it until I turned 16. I did get caught driving it, for what it's worth, and paid a fine. Okay, but your criteria for your first car was you needed three things. It needed to be a V8, a two-door, and a standard shift. That had all those things. So the very first Ford, 55 Ford, was a 272 cubic inch. I forget there's a name for those engines. Somebody will remember it. The Thunderbird 312 engine was basically the same architecture. And what are the first things you do when you get your first hot rod? I was making about $1 an hour. I paid $225 for that car. It took me months to save enough for it. And very first thing you do, you put dual exhaust on it, and you move the shifter from the column onto the floor. And then you probably weld a new floor in it because they're 9 years old. It's probably rusted out by then. Anyway, that was my only Ford car. Nothing against them, just the way things go. And I've had lots of different kinds of cars, but that's the only Ford car I've ever had. So enough of that. So leaks. We all hate leaks. And I got a new customer. I sold the engine that I dynoed last, the 355 that we had on the dyno. It's sitting there. We're going to demonstrate. He's on the way here right now. And one of the things he's worried about is leaks. So that prompted me to make this video because leaks are a big problem. And one of the things that's happened is in the Gen 2 engines, the Coyote and the Mopar and the LS style engines, when they designed those engines, they looked back at the Gen 1 and said, what do we need to improve that? And one of the things they did was sealing them so they don't leak. And the LS engines virtually use no gasket sealer. They're all embedded, captured seals, etc., and virtually do not leak. But if you have a Gen 1, they do. So I'm going to cover off. I got a whole bunch of show and tell stuff here for you today. I'm going to cover off all the different kinds of leaks and in order of their importance. So let's start. Michael put a screenshot. So this is just to keep me going. Rear main seal leak. So why is the rear main seal the most dreaded leak? It's because it's the hardest one to fix. If you have a rear main seal leak in the Gen 1 car, you got to take the oil pan off to fix it. You got to take the rear main bearing out to fix it. And you probably got to take the engine out to get at those things. So a rear main seal is surely common. A lot of Gen 1 engines, the Pontiacs, Oldsmobiles, Buicks, etc., and a lot of other kinds of cars, I'm not trying to make an official list, use rope seals they were definitely prone to leak, and they were replaced by lip seals. So here's an example of I'll put this down for a second. This is a rear main seal from a small block Chev. Anybody who's built one recognizes it. You got to make sure you got the lip facing towards the front of the engine. And typically when we install it, you install it so it's not exactly at the parting line of the crankshaft and the main bearing. You actually rotate it about 3/8, maybe half an inch or so you don't have the parting line lined up with the engine. And I do put a little dab of silicone right here when I'm installing it. You don't have to, they don't recommend it, but it works for me. And I've had pretty good luck with sealing. So, but if you want to look at why the Gen 2 engines, there's a seal out of a Gen 2 small block Chev, like the engine in my Camaro, for example, and the LS is the same. So these are externally balanced because made this section for the seal so big they didn't have room for the counterweights. That's why they're externally balanced. So what seal do you think is going to work the best? That guy that's fitted over with basically with a jig that goes over a hub to seal the engine, or this little guy here? So that's one big improvement, is the one-piece seal. Now, one of the reasons why a lot of engines do leak, whether they leak when they were new, is that when engines get rebuilt, the crankshaft often, on the place where this lip runs, the crankshaft gets a little groove in it, especially if you're in a dirty environment and you get a lot of grit in there, and it puts a little groove in the crankshaft. So when you install a new seal, it lines up with that groove, and guess what? It's going to leak too. So the answer to that, and this number is for a small block Chev, I'm back to that. This is an offset seal. It's Velcro BS11 829-1. And this is an offset seal for a small block Chev. And what that does is moves the point of contact of the lip on the crankshaft over about 50 thousandths or so, and gets it away from that worn part of the crankshaft. Because if your crankshaft has their groove worn in it, there's not much you can do about it. You can't turn it because it's going to be too small then, right? And cost of welding and turning it is probably prohibitive. If anybody's ever done that, let me know. But that is one solution. And there is one other thing. So in the Pontiacs and Buicks, I've never done a Buick, but I've done lots of Pontiacs. The original seal was, once again, a rope seal, and that's replaced by a one-piece seal. There's 2 or 3 different makers, and there's also a 2-piece seal that I've used, which is a similar design to this one, but it's, I'm not sure this is Viton or some form of plastic or whatever, anyway, as opposed to rope seal. So that's one thing. If you're building a 400 small block and you get it line home, what happens when you do that? The standard seal is 2900, Velcro 2900 seal. And let's double check that. And that's for standard. The offset one is 11829, 2909, because when you line bore a 400 cubic inch engine, because the crankshaft tunnel is bigger, it takes out part of the seal where the seal goes, and so you need a special seal which is the Velcro 2909-1. So that's rear main seal leaks. If you got one, it's always serious because, as I said, it's a big job to fix it. And if your crankshaft is worn, you could take it out, change the seal, and still have a leak. So that's frustrating, and it's always a concern when you're building a Gen 1 engine. So the next one, I think, is a timing cover to the seal. So this is a timing cover. There's a gasket goes here, and we use some sealant. I'm going to talk about that as well on that gasket. But that's not likely where it's going to leak. Where it's going to leak is, this is the seal. I've already got one. This is Tony's timing cover, by the way. I already got seal installed. That's the seal. These seals typically don't leak, but it's the same problem on the front shaft where what rubs on here is your harmonic balancer. Rubs on this spot, contacts with this spot. The harmonic balancer can also get a groove worn into it. and had the same problem as the rear main seal. So here's the fix. Dropped it, sorry. Is these little shields, sleeves, slide over your balancer, and that provides a new surface. They're thin enough that they still work with the seal, and that will solve that problem if your balancer's got wear in it. So that's available. That's a Felpro, the kit that comes with the seal and with the shield. So that's one solution for rear main seal and front seal. So talking about Permatex now. So there's different kinds of Permatex. Read up on that. Some are better with oil. Some Permatex is better for high temperature. The gold or copper is usually for high temperature. The blue is typically for water. The ultra black or ultra gray is typically good for oil. This is oil resistant. So I use ultra gray or ultra black. They both seem to work well. You don't use very much, but one of the things that you have to remember if you're using Permatex on the gasket, don't use very much, but when you first install it, just snug the bolts up and give it an hour or so to set up, and then finish your torquing after that. If you torque them immediately, that stuff is still pretty soft and pliable, and you just might squeeze it out of there, and then it's not going to do you much good. So that's one thing to consider. So what's the next one here now? Let me cover oil pan gasket. So oil pan gasket is another big problem, because if you have an oil pan gasket leak and you can't fix it by just tightening it, and you got to take your oil pan off, you got to take your engine out. So one of the things we used to do with an engine rebuild is buy a kit. Felpro makes some, other people do, with every gasket in that you need. Your oil pan gasket, rear main seal, front seal, timing cover gasket, all that stuff. The problem is we don't do that anymore, because the problem is we don't end up using most of the seals, because they're not really the best. So we usually use a custom head gasket anyway. The kit comes with head gaskets. I've got a whole stack of original Felpro 40 thou head gaskets here that I'll probably never use. So we use a special head gasket, special valve cover. So we end up not using very many. So there is, the other thing is the original OEM style gasket is made out of cork, and it's called a 4-piece gasket, because this is one side of the rail, pan rail, another one on the other side, and then to get from side to side, you have a deal like this. So they all got to be sealed. It takes a lot of Permatex. You got to use Permatex if you're going to use this gasket. And if you're not careful and you over torque it, they're going to leak on you. So our standard practice now is using a one-piece gasket like this one. This is a Felpro. The number of Felpro is, excuse me for turning my back on you, OS 34509-T. So this is a one-piece gasket. It's made of a better material. It actually comes with little dowels to line it up. And it's actually designed so if you torque it properly, you really can't do damage to it, because where the bolts go in, it holds it from you over squeezing the gasket. So this is standard practice for us now. They're not cheap, but they're well worth the investment, and I would never do anything else. And by the time you use up all the Permatex it takes to seal this guy, these are probably not that expensive either. So that's the solution for oil pan gaskets. I'm going to talk a bit about how to find leaks in a minute. I'll get to that. That's really important. But I want to cover the kinds of leaks. Oil pan. So I'll tell you a little. Your oil pan can have a leak too. Oil pans can rust out. Made a video recently about my Z28. So when I bought that car, my brother-in-law bought a brand new 69 Z28, beautiful car with the nice hood on it, the ram air hood, or if you get what you call it now, and 4-speed, 410 rear end. And we drove home from Toronto that night, 8-hour drive, and I was following him. I had oil on my windshield. What's going on? So we kept checking the oil. We got home, put it up on the hoist. Brand new car, okay? You just bought it. It had a pinhole where the weld was on the side of the oil pan, and we had to fix that. So you can have a leak in your oil pan too. Now, if it's brand new, typically they don't but it can happen. So you have to watch for that. Drain plug gasket. So you can be looking at a whole bunch of stuff, and it could be just something as simple as your drain plug's not tight, or the gaskets have been used too many times and it's not working for you anymore. So that's the checklist of things to check. Oil galley plug. So where can I show you? Oil galley plugs. Come around here, Alec. Every engine's got, well, I guess, yeah, they got a cover on the front. So oil galley, 3 plugs on the front and the back. And there's other plugs. There's one right here under the block. You have to make sure you got that plug before you put your head on, because you got to take the head off to fix it. And there's a few other openings. Typically, they don't leak. They're pipe plugs. They're torqued to about 15 foot-pounds. Typically, they don't leak, but they can. And especially on a new engine, if they weren't installed properly or tightened properly, and that oil will find itself down to the same place that it would be if it was a rear main seal. So you have to be careful of that. The China wall. Okay, here's the China wall right here where your intake manifold sits. And that is a place for it to leak. The standard practice nowadays for most guys is, I'm going to have a tip of the day about this, is to use a bead of Permatex, but you use quite a bit of Permatex. The problem is they all come with, the gasket kits typically come, anyway, with a gasket like that fits over the China wall just like that, okay? And the problem is now with aftermarket heads and aftermarket intake manifold, sometimes the heads are planed or cut or whatever, and that can be prone to leak, partly because if you haven't got a big enough gap, it'll actually stop your manifold from going down and cause your manifold to leak. So most guys just take these and throw them away and use a bead of Permatex in there. Takes a little bit of practice to get that a nice even bead. You don't slop too much of it in there, but it takes a lot of Permatex. So China wall is one, and other engines are different. The openings are different. Pontiac, for example, doesn't have a China wall, but Chevrolet does. The Pontiac's a totally different deal. They have a valley pan, and the valley pan gasket can be a source of leak. China wall, fuel pump adapter. So I guess we'll use this engine. This plate here that the fuel pump, now because I run on the dyno, I don't use a fuel pump, so I got it blocked off. But if you have your fuel pump, it's bolted there. This little gasket in here can leak, or where the fuel pump bolts to it. Or, so what's that look like? I got this here for my customer. So the push rod goes in there, and that's the jumping around here a little bit. Sorry about that. Okay, so that can leak on that side, or it can leak on the side where the fuel pump. Or the fuel pump can actually leak oil also. So lots of possibilities. Here's another one. So this little bolt right here is designed so that when you install a fuel pump, if you've ever done one that's really, really hard, get in there and hold the fuel pump lever up when you're installing the fuel pump, and hold the push rod up, sorry. So what happens is the push rod is inside the engine, just like that, goes against the camshaft. So what you can do is get the push rod out of the way, and then use a long bolt in here, push on the push rod, it just holds it from falling back down. It's easy to install your fuel pump, and then once your fuel pump is installed, you take this bolt back out. This is open to oil. And if that hole is not plugged with another 3/8 bolt and some sealant, you can have an oil leak come out of there. That's one that can really fool you if you're not aware that you can get a leak from that cause. So that hole can leak oil. Distributor gasket. So the distributor has a little gasket like this. Typically they don't, but they can. Okay, that comes on the bottom of the distributor, just like that. Okay, and that goes right against your intake manifold. And things are different. Small block Chev is different, whatever. But at some point, this point has to get to where there's oil, because there's oil down here, right? So it needs to be sealed. So that's another possible cause that you want to look for. Valve covers. So that's probably the most common leak is valve covers. And one of the things that reasons we don't use the Felpro kits anymore. They come with a valve cover gasket that's about like this. They're not great. So there's lots of premium style gaskets. These are Summit ones. They're hard rubber. I've used these with good results. I can't get the price of them right now, but this is a valve cover gasket for the later engines, the Vortex style engines with the center bolt valve covers. So you don't have any holes, because typically a lot of times the leak is around the hole somewhere. So they don't have any holes. They have 4 bolts holding the valve cover on from the top. And there's other nice seals, valve cover. These actually are used. If you look closely, you can see there's a little piece of metal in between the 2 pieces of cork, and that gives it some strength. As I say, this is a used one. That gives it some firmness and strength, because one of the problems with the inexpensive ones is when you go to put your valve cover on, they don't even stay lined up in the holes. So that's the problem. So valve cover leaks are probably the most common. The best thing about them, they're easiest to fix, because you can usually get your valve covers off, without too much trouble. So oil pressure gauge or line fitting. So your gauge in a small block typically goes in here. That's where the oil pressure, and a lot of gauges in cars, you actually have a little copper line, or OEMs had a plastic line. Okay, it went from here right to the gauge. Okay, so you got oil pressure, whatever oil pressure your engine's got, reading that gauge, you got oil pressure in that line, and it can leak. I had a customer call me not long ago, a few months ago, sold him an engine a year or 2 ago. He was worried that he had an oil leak, and we made a list like this, and he checked everything out, and at first he couldn't find it. And his actually has a copper pipe. It's a big block. This fitting is actually on the side of the big block, just above the oil filter. And that copper pipe had a little pinhole in it, so it saw pressure. So while I'm talking about pressure, one thing to note: most gaskets and seals in an engine don't see pressure. Say, oh, I put too much pressure, it's going to blow all my seals. No, they just see a lot of splash around. But even your rear main seal, your front seal, you do not see oil pressure. Your gauge, however, and the line to your gauge does see oil pressure. The rest only see splash. So what else we got here? Fuel pump. Okay, I already mentioned that, the fuel pump dry shaft. So those are the things that can happen. And some ways, if you use the right products, when it comes to oil leaks, pretty much I would do anything to make sure I'm not going to have an oil leak. But what if you do? How do you find it? And one of the problems is with oil leaks, they can really fool you, because it doesn't matter where the leak starts. It ends up in the bottom of your engine. It ends up either in your inspection cover over your flywheel, or in an automatic transmission. It ends up in that housing below. And how do you trace that back? The other thing that happens when your car is moving, okay, with the airflow under the car and acceleration, the oil all tends to flow to the back. So you could have a leak at the front of your engine, and you're chasing something at the rear of the engine, because that's not where it's there. Even if you look at this engine, for example, if your engine isn't perfectly level, you could get a little leak right here, come down and get on the oil pan rail and run all the way to the back, okay, go to the bottom and come out just where the rear main seal is, and you could be chasing or thinking you got a rear main seal leaking, taking your engine out, fixing your rear main seal, and that wasn't even the cause of it. So when you're trying to find leaks, you got to get the engine hot. Hopefully you got to be under there where it's running. Be careful you don't fix the wrong thing, because it's not hard to get tricked with oil leaks. Start with the simplest, easiest things to solve, like valve covers, for example, and work your way through it. There's a list you can use as a checklist, and hopefully you can find it and fix it without major problems. The other thing is, as I mentioned earlier, with some engines, even with the seal on them and all the things I mentioned, they may still leak a little bit anyways, even if you do all this stuff. So that can happen. And we're talking OEMs from North America right now, Ford, GM, and Mopar. And Alex is nodding his head because he's got an MG that leaks oil. And there's no solution. Some cars are just made to leak oil. And if you have an older car and it's got a rope seal, for example, unless you're willing to do sort of major surgery, it's going to continue to do that. And there's no solution. Some cars are just made to leak oil. And if you have an older car and it's got a rope seal, for example, unless you're willing to do sort of major surgery, it's going to continue to do that. Please like and subscribe. Please give me some, those likes really mean a lot. I mean, you might think that it doesn't matter, but it matters a lot to us. Subscriptions matter a lot to us. We need to grow to make doing this make sense. And if they keep growing, we're doing fine, but we got to keep that moving. And if you like the content, please help me out. Like, subscribe, share, all that kind of stuff. I'd really appreciate that. Tip of the day. So I mentioned at first that the standard process is, even if you buy a lot of times intake manifolds, it'll say in the instructions, don't try to use this seal. Because the problem is, if it is thicker than it needs to be, it'll prevent your intake manifold from sealing. So it can get you in trouble, whereas Permatex will just squash it into place. So, but I have used these many times with great success. And what they do, they save me from gooping a whole pile of Permatex on it. But what you got to do is sit them on the China wall, the front and the back, sit your manifold down and measure the gap you got between the manifold and the block. If your gap is thicker than this is, then use this and a little bit of Permatex on the top to seal it, and you'll be good to go. Instead of using that volume, you'll end up using a lot of this stuff anyway if you use it on your China wall. Now, a lot of times I end up not using it anyway because the manifold comes down too close. This is thicker than the gap, and for that reason, it's going to cause me a problem, and I use Permatex like everybody else. There's another one that's a Permatex product called Right Stuff. A lot of guys use that. It's pretty good stuff. I think one of the big advantages of it is that it sets up in a short period of time. So if you're a garage or something repairing stuff and you need to get it sealed right now, you get it going, and that's what you want to use. Typically, I don't have that situation. A lot of times, once again, I'll put the sealant on it, let it sit and cure for at least an hour, and then come back and do the final torquing after it's had a chance to set up. Otherwise, you're just going to squash it out of place. So that's my tip of the day. Don't throw these away. I got lots of them, by the way, so because I don't use them all the time. But they actually can work pretty good. Sometimes I don't need anything but a little bit of a seal on them. Hope you found that interesting, and thank you for watching Gold's Garage.